Okay, now I've thought of a way to quite simply illustrate the point of at least the distinction between the proto-fascist social justice movement and the real fascists. And I think it can be very easily illustrated by looking at, for example, in America, the SJW movement is, at least ideologically, aligned with Antifa. They are anti-fascist in America. Whereas you apply that same movement, the same ideology, same identity politics to the South African context, and essentially they are pro-fascist in that sense. Because they don't actually have a problem with fascism, it's just that the fascism must be in service of their concept of justice. So they're completely compatible with fascism as long as the fascism fulfills this other rung of ideological utility, which is that you get the justice, which is some kind of like equal outcome between groups, some such thing. So and then the complexity starts to creep in, because that equality has two sides to it. There's a negative account sheet, and then there's a positive account sheet. And so the negative account sheet will be the damage that each group identity has historically been subjected to, the subjective hurt and pain, which has a kind of cultural manifestation as well on the pride of the culture itself. So it's this kind of pride matrix in terms of how much shame one group has had relative to other groups. And there's a lot of mythology cast on this because, some groups have their stories told louder, and their stories that are told louder are, the violins play quite loudly, and then you have the positive side, which is like, you could call that the present condition or the present state, which is that the present condition of statistically measured disparity between groups. So the one is kind of an equality of outcome of some sort of positive case, and then there's a kind of a quality of relativism in terms of hurt that each group has had. Now, what's funny is that they use the moral force of the negative argument in terms of the damage. So it's the damage accounting sheet which gives them the moral authority to claim the center of culture and to claim the high ground of moral authority, and to cast an orthodoxy in that, in which they're allowed to bully and mock anyone who doesn't buy into that kind of emotional revenge argument, that you must have a kind of eye for an eye in terms of the shame. And then at the point at which they stop, and you see, this is the promise. The promise is actually they just want, on the positive side, they want everyone to have the same outcome in terms of the statistical sharing in the wealth, or any positive thing that's quantifiable. They've got a whole quantifiable things, and so they will often so these are the two fragments of their kind of moral universe, that the one justifies the indulgence in the other effectively. And so because the one has a disparity, that allows a kind of authoritarian control of the other. And they sometimes, and you can see this in the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters in South Africa, the fascist black nationalistic party, essentially, that they will often have inconsistent rhetoric. They will often say, they'll often call for quite, they will call for violence implicitly or even explicitly, and they'll kind of toy with it on some level. And they'll call for disruption, and they'll call for, because we just want, you can do any chaos, you can do any mayhem, because the point at which that we're doing this is to cause agitation and to reach the edge first, to force the issue, because we just want the kind of equality of the positive scale, that we want people to be in the same position. And so things aren't going well enough, and so we can indulge in any kind of revenge, violence, or whatever, until we get sort of equity on the positive scale, in terms of that everyone is equally represented in every field, in every sort of wealth category, in every sort of breakdown of anything. And so you can kind of be heavy-handed on that side. And then on the reverse side, when they basically try to be good legal positivists and say, no, okay, well, because there hasn't been equal pain and shame on different equality groups, we're allowed to kind of tilt the legal structure, and to kind of manhandle the kind of the and force a kind of legal redistribution of kind of have the authoritarian hand in the private scale of society and the economy, because it's only just that. And in that sense, when they do it from that side, at least they seem, it's all veils of deception, but at least they're pretending to be the paternal caretaker of the kind of the condition of reality, and that they would actually be responsible caretakers. The problem is that whenever they fail in these sorts of measures, it's always because people aren't submitting themselves like good sheep to the slaughter, to kind of, or lambs to the slaughter, to kind of take on and absorb the abuse which is, required of them, because their identity hasn't engaged in the same level of depreciating value according to the identity matrix, which needs to be brought into equilibrium. And when you make culture and you make economics about that, which really has, all of this, bullshit has nothing to do with expanding or growing the fundamentals of a free market system and a capitalist, so it's like you're going to done goof the fundamental mechanics of capitalism, and there's nothing Marxist about that. There's nothing Marxist about dismantling. The point is that capitalism is supposed to destroy itself. You're not supposed to kind of, it's the Leninist deviation that you're supposed to kind of, there's so much deception in terms of Lenin, because Lenin's like, we can't trust history, we can't go forward with capitalism, we should revolt before we even start capitalism. But when you already have an established capitalistic framework, to fuck that up, to kind of, to throw that under the bus, just to suit some kind of fascistic bullshit, which is, it's really just a kind of group psychopathy. It really is like a cultural it's a psychopath culture that is trying to kind of veil itself under the seductive moral authority of, having this mass hysteria over so-called social justice. It's well, okay, let me just center the talk back to, because I did get some part into describing the distinction between fascism and the proto-fascism, is that in essence the proto-fascists, the social justice movement, which I'm calling the proto-fascists, it really is the best way to understand what it is that their idea of justice comes from basically not thinking through the means of which they have philosophically constructed their operating framework. So they've got these kind of arguments and these kind of sentiments, is the best way to put it, and which make up the attitudes that make up the social justice movement, so-called social justice. And those attitudes come from having that negative accounting sheet and that positive accounting sheet, and then thinking that there is some vector in which you can kind of play with one or both, and that somehow you reach some kind of point of equilibrium, or that there's some that's the map, or at least it's the rules, the procedural rules of how to the attitudes that make this up give you the procedural rules of how to kind of this is going to be a bit of a strange metaphor, but it tells you how to basically depict what's happening in reality and reduce it into a map that you can use to kind of survey reality, and to sort of allow yourself to kind of plan and manage resources and such, and so in a kind of moral landscape as well. So and the thing is that the promise is that when you use these procedural rules to generate such a map, to manufacture such a map, that when you have because in some sense their map is not quite ever completed. It doesn't get fully filled in, but the implicit promise is that when you do a good job of following those attitudes, those sentiments, at constructing that map, that the map will actually have somewhere on it the point at which everything works. It kind of, there will be a treasure spot on the map. There will be a point at which the map will show you the best place to make paradise. It's kind of, the map will reveal where so the map will allow you to plot your path and to arriving at the paradise. And when you actually start to engage and this project, and it really is a project, it is a fascist project, eventually you see that actually what paradise is actually a walled city that only exists for one identity. And what you actually get from that map is that actually the only way to have a stable, when you're following these rules, the only way that you could stabilize it is by having a kind of separate but equal development. You would have to have some kind of non-interaction, or incredibly very limited interaction. And even limited interaction would be it would give an opportunity for the kind of the psychopaths and the fascist personalities within each group to just blame those other people on the outside for all the failings on the inside, and will use that as a culture of denying self-criticism and denying the humility of actually developing transformation on any level. We can't change our culture. We can't adapt our culture. We must not change. And if things don't go our way and things aren't improving for us, it's because the out group has hurt us and cheated us in history. And because we've been knocked off course, we'll never achieve what we deserved. So it's always trapped in this historical frame where accountability and responsibility and self-criticism never gets developed, because you can just tap into the psychopathy of basically saying that your environment, you're just reacting logically to your environment, and then when it becomes a kind of a war of power, of just fighting for power, of who gets to command the redistribution, or who gets to command the political authoritarian solution, because you're saying that, oh well, that's all it is anyway, because when the market is operating, unless it's regulated and harassed and confined into so much red tape that it can't actually fluidly come up with measures that help develop and build the country. No, the authoritarian must have all the credit. So you will only hire because you are forced to hire. And then when people can't cope with how you are forced to hire in terms of how it was conceived and planned out by policy, because it's basically, it's a one size fits all, which means that effectively the people who do benefit from that kind of policy are treated like tokens. They are conceived of as tokens by the policymakers. In fact, it's a kind of redistributive ideological payback on some level. And so you don't get any of the real, authentic building blocks. None of that is allowed. In fact, any of that is actually suppressed, because if you do that, it's probably not going to conform to the policy, and if it doesn't conform to the policy, it's going to be effectively punished by the policy. And so you can only make any progress if you do it in the way in which the policy maker conceived of it, and that's conceived in such a coercive way that effectively only really big companies can afford to do that. And they will, they might not like it. It might be a waste of money for them, but it's somewhat even better for them, because they are shielded from all the companies who would be their competitors, who are too small to put up with that kind of red tape. So it's this wonderful kind of protectionism for the corporate sector. And so you completely destroy the small and medium business sector, which can't cope with these sorts of impossible quotas and such, and labor laws as well, which are just incredibly burdensome, that you can't risk hiring people because there's no ethos of skills development in some sense, and so it's very hard to actually try to create the ladder when you've got people that are trying to basically maintain these corrupted redistribution things, which threaten the kind of the longevity and the economic base. But I mean, at this point now, you've got people trying to cover over the corruption, this ideological and just outright stealing corruption, with more promises that you just need to amp up the same revenge rhetoric, like that. Oh well, if we hand out equal portions, or it's very possible that in this sort of climate, things get closer and closer to tipping toward, because as soon as the people at the top misstep enough that it literally, makes the whole system collapse, then the collapse just gets totally blamed on the other group, on the minority group. Yeah, so in America, obviously, where they are anti-fascist, it's very easy to keep that idea of that, oh, well, we just need to commit ourselves to creating this map, which will eventually, when we've absorbed enough energy and translated enough of our present reality into constructing this map, it'll tell us where paradise is. It'll show us the way. And when that map doesn't resolve that, because it actually as you start building that map, it gets more and more dire. In fact, it gets more and more desperate, because essentially you can see that either you have to admit that the the ideology itself is not workable, that it doesn't actually offer real solutions to its own problems. And years ago, even I came across an SJW who even admitted that. They were like, no, I believe in the morality of it, but I know for a fact, because she kind of was practical enough, she was pragmatic enough, that if you try to address the problem on those lines, they don't improve, they don't get better. She at least had her eyes enough open that she could see that when you indulge in the measures which are advocated by identity politics, the situation doesn't get better. It metastasizes. It gets far more dire and desperate, and it makes it kind of acrimonious, and it kind of, makes it divisive on the point of like, where you get to these people who are like activist professionals. And I don't mean professional activists. I mean like people who are like, there's so many of them, people who are like landscapers, but they're like activist landscapers. And so it's like they don't actually know what it is that they're doing. They essentially want to be paid to do a job badly, which they don't know how to do. And the point is that, well, they don't know how to do it because they were never schooled properly, because identity politics teaches them that they were deprived. And so to get back at the system, they have to try and destabilize it by pretending to be something that they're not. And that's the activism, is that they should be regarded as something that they deserve to be, but were deprived by the system. It's this really, I mean, it's on the measure at which psychopaths actually operate. That's kind of how psychopaths sort of game their system to some degree. There's some very good videos on that. I'm going to put a link to that, but I think that there is a huge link between culture and I mean, and it did start with feminism. It really did. Although there has generally always been this cultural element. I mean, there are a lot of subcultures and many cultures that have this kind of thinking. Usually, in a successful culture, it is suppressed, or at least repressed through consciousness. That these arguments are bad arguments. They have negative feedback loops built in them. They're viciously abysmal at sort of making a situation worse. It's like the archetypal or stereotypical person who listens to black metal or whatever, and just sort of sits there playing video games and absorbing this kind of, having this kind of strange rush subconsciously, at least, so that they can numb themselves from, some kind of environmental constraint, which they're trying to kind of internalize and incorporate. And so they're feeding off their own negative emotion and well, okay, that's perhaps a bit of a red herring to throw in there, but it's interesting because there are a collection of these temperaments which are somewhat almost in analogous roles to one another, although they don't all have the exact same behavior. I've talked about this in one of my other videos, the beta quadra personality styles in socionics, or a lot of these people kind of fit into the intuitive feeling quadra in MBTI. Although, as far as I can see, the ones who manifest it quite badly, generally they have some kind of NETI, FE, ENFJs are incredibly, they're almost like demagogues on the social level, and they are very prone to generating drama. They're very good at manipulating settings to create perfect sound bites which they can use later. It's like they conceive of a scenario so that it will precipitate for them a sob story, or just like 3 lines of things that they can repeat to other people. They are masterful at this, because it's such an interesting, specious, way of kind of social manipulation. And it's funny, a lot of women who do this, they can't do it too much, because then people will start to see through it, and so they'll kind of some of them will kind of float between 3 different circles of friends, because they will kind of work out that you can't. In fact, some of them will even have a circle of friends that they never do it with, because that'll be their kind of stable base or whatever. But because if they do it too much in the same circle, people will eventually tire of them. That oh well, all the cool people that we come across, you invent stories about them, and like, yes, something happened, but it's always strangely confused. It's like it's all built on a kind of a web of secrets, which they are the gatekeepers of. They make deals to make people do weird things, to kind of precipitate plot points that allows them to force certain issues. They are masterful. It's almost like a spider spinning a web. And I mean, that's exactly what it's like. It's kind of contrived. It is contrived preemptively. It's kind of it's plotted out. I mean, it's. I was about to say it's borderline sociopathic, but it might also be borderline personality disorder to a large extent as well. But I mean, actually, what I'm describing would be borderline, not with narcissism, just borderline. The narcissistic borderline people are they can be manipulative, but they generally try to exude charisma. And so, they can be bullying on that level. They can be Machiavellian. The narcissistic ones can be Machiavellian, but they anyway, this is a tangent, but it's very interesting that the kind of the zoo of personality styles out there, which I do think that there's a level of psychological politics which is certainly opened up when people start down these fascistic, winding up these fascistic political vehicles of a kind of project which is based on how a personality style interfaces with their. I mean, I've often told people, and I think other people have had the same opinion, although I haven't heard it from another source, is that I do think that the Nazi system was probably predicated on Hitler's mother. That's my guess, is that he had some sort of whoever his female primary caretaker was probably a psychopath, and he probably tapped into it. It's strange because and kind of politically weaponized it. I think that's probably what happened. That he kind of he was toyed by it at some point, and then he kind of and then he broke out of sympathizing with it, and then he kind of grappled with it and understood it, and then he kind of weaponized it, as he probably already had some level of psychological compatibility with it. He probably had some level of codependency with it. And in certain cultures, this stuff is really big. I mean, and I do think that that's why some cultures do suffer. That they suffer from having a lot of their a lot of the cultural stereotypes. I'm just trying to how to describe it. There are. Can't remember the sociological terms, but within an ethos, within a culture, there's somewhat of a shared space of what is understood as acceptable, and within those kind of common notions, which even if you don't agree with, they are at least depicted and shared in some form as just the kind of the basis to work on. You have to have some level of shorthand, even if it's to refer to it so that you can disagree with it, so that you can get into a meta description. If you're going to waste a lot of time unless you submit yourself to kind of, everyone has to be a member of a culture. That's what in fact it means. But you also have to realize that some cultures are just better than others, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is a bit of horse trading. You have to make a choice, this or that, or something like that. Maybe there are ways of having it the best of both worlds. And that's why I think diversity, multiculturalism is some form of it is definitely important and good. But you have to protect multiculturalism against psychopathy, against fascism. Against the destabilizing, forces of something like identity politics with their fake social justice, which is really what they call social justice, is their excuse to kind of destroy a kind of a real diversity and to have a tyranny of some sort, definitely, and a cultural orthodoxy. But unless you can criticize culture. And you see, this is the thing, is that identity politics does not criticize culture. These white privilege things, you're not allowed to deconstruct them. When I said you can't, you're not allowed to talk about them. If you sort of take down these champions of theirs, you are an affront to their progress. You're an affront to their moral progress. And their orthodoxy, you're challenging it. And the best way to actually challenge a lot of these ideas, because they are based on taking themselves so seriously. And if you mock them, or if you sort of, this is why they're so aggressive to the artist and to the comedian. Is because you're giving room to something which is essentially incompatible with fascist culture, which is the idea that you need a strong authoritarian intervention to dispense justice and treat us all like objects of history. We are all just the effects, the after effects of history. And until someone is brave enough to come forward and to authoritarianly manage the historical inheritance that everyone has, then we'll never progress forward. And so everything is just put into this map, into this plan of just waiting to have the map fully fleshed out so that paradise can be identified, and then within the paradise, when we all get there, then we can start again, and then we can kind of all be equal. But the point is that when you get close to finishing that map, as I said, you just get walled cities of separate but equal development, or you get some kind of disgusting apartheid, or you get some kind of, you get what Hitler wanted. You get the sort of one identity for each nation, or some such thing. It doesn't. You can't have a shared terrain with people that effectively you would have to constantly filter yourself. Because identity politics is not about destroying identity. It's about destroying the differences of identity, which you can try and make it into one phrase, but whatever phrase you make, it doesn't make sense. It can never make sense. It has to be nonsense to think that you could make paradise in those terms from those materials. So you're going to have people that are essentially different, but they must be equal somehow. What could that ever mean? How could that ever be made meaningful? That's literally like saying we're all going to see things differently, and so therefore we must all promise to agree that they must be equal. And if we can't do that linguistically, and we can't sort of force language to always compensate so that we all get the same feeling of having this kind of pervasive authoritarian paternalist force that is showering us with their rainbow Hitler rays equally across the land. If someone steps outside of that, then we must string them up and burn them at the stake. Like it's like what like it. What can you do? And the idea that a lot of the thing is that well, let's just do it a little bit. Like maybe we're not saying that it's going to be paradise, but it's going to be way better. Like, well, what do you actually want to do on the ground? As soon as they actually describe a policy, I mean, it's disgusting. It's like literally the worst kind of retributivist shit show that you can imagine. It's the kind of, we should have rape kangaroo courts where we don't have rules of evidence and we can penalize people ad hocly, and we don't have the rule of let's just suspend the rule of law. Like, no. I mean, like, look, if you have a problem with something, if you have a cultural problem, then you need to come up with a cultural solution. You can't just have this kind of authoritarian parental force that sorts it out for people. Like, yes, there are real problems in the world, and they probably do need to be solved. They don't need to be solved by having Gestapo responses to things. You don't have to have secret police making lists of people's names. Like, maybe people do need to change their behavior. And when I say people do need to change behavior, I'm talking about the victims. I'm talking about victim blaming. I'm talking about fucking responsibility. Take it. Like, literally, like, if there's a certain reality in which you have to contend with, and you might be able to actually, in compromising yourself enough to actually take responsibility, you might actually find the strength to find a new way of doing things when you actually take that level of accountability and self-determinism. You might actually become a better person, a stronger person, rather than just this kind of infantile, we need the people who I find offensive need to be viciously attacked by some kind of paternalist dog squad. I mean, it's a fascistic worldview that they have. It really is the most kind of, and I mean, and this is why they are generally seen as the scum that they are, because they will wail and they will whine and they will, indulge in like transforming themselves into some kind of avatar of superior justice and fluidity, of being able to see this whole field of identity, and kind of I've spoken about this in another recording, that this trance, and trance as a political vehicle. I'm fine with people who are actually, like, for example, transgender, like, authentically. They're not just doing it because of this kind of the social props and the social maneuvering as a kind of, they're not doing it for their sexuality as much as they're doing it for their political sexuality. Okay, I'm not going to go into that issue too much, because I did have gone into it quite deeply on another recording. Because it really, it does hinge on there's a segment of certain personality styles where that is their interface. They want to be the exception to the rules of society, and they want to kind of project that power. And in this kind of particular atmosphere, they're kind of one-upping the SJWs, because their whole life is a kind of activism of being morally superior to people around them, and being able to extract a kind of special counter-ideological privilege, which is in the shadow of the shame which other people should feel for not, pandering to them effectively. And so, and pandering to them in essentially what is an impossible way. The people who are authentically transgender, generally, they actually, they're doing it as an expression of their sexuality, and generally the only trans person that I'll ever respect is essentially a It is someone who is like authentically a libertarian, because then they're actually doing it for, let's say, for they've rationalized it, at least themselves, in terms of sexuality. They haven't rationalized it through some kind of weird interface. I mean, like, yes, there are secondary issues about how to interface with society, and these people generally always find, even the authentic transgender people, obviously, it's not easy to not live in a world that doesn't sort of cater to them, and that essentially, even them, I mean, if they think about it enough, they'll realize that they a lot of them that are libertarian, that are generally, I would say, very stable, they come to peace with the understanding that they can't expect to be fully accepted, because they do want to be the other sex, and if you want that, and that involved changing yourself, it's something that is intrinsically part of negotiating your own personal communication to other people, and you have to do that on a personal level. You can't just expect some kind of societal space to be safe for you, and to kind of already, get in line with very sophisticated rationalizations which are compatible with your personal decision. Like that is really asking too much. That's really on the level of some kind of autism or solipsism, of kind of expecting the world to kind of mirror your like the particular rationalizations which you've decided on that morning as you fluidly do this or that. It's I mean, that's kind of psychopathic. I would even say, but as I was saying, the people who are okay, I have, as I've said, I have gone into this issue in another recording, so I don't want to recap too much. I think there's one more piece of that general issue, which but it is very interesting that it's kind of it's effectively just a more sophisticated application of fascist reasoning. It's just so identity politics in general is just a more sophisticated version of Nazi philosophy, and in fact, it was exactly the same philosophy which the fascists propagated in generating what they even termed useful idiots. This is, I believe it's all in Mein Kampf, that he talks about using the useful idiots who aren't part of the movement, but that effectively are great at spreading it. And so this is the progressivism which fueled the Nuremberg rallies in Weimar Germany, that kind of destabilized the Weimar Republic, and that helped force the politicians to pander to these policies and these measures and this progressivism, which even in continental Europe amounted to this general feeling of appeasing Hitler. And now we've basically got history repeating itself in South Africa. I guess when a black movement becomes fascistic, hopefully at least post that, whatever happens in the future, racism will effectively have, there'll be good enough arguments therefore to not be racist, to not treat people differently, that black people can be just like the Germans, like there's no difference, that we have to understand culture, we have to understand psychological politics, and we have to understand the kind of the ideological claims that people are making. And the kind of the problems of I mean, this has been a long time coming, and what I mean by that is in the context of the prophecies of Marshall McLuhan in terms of the global village, which never happened from the television, but which did happen when the television started uploading as well as downloading, which is effectively what the personal computer is. Okay, that's completely a separate topic, but I guess I'm going to end the recording.